All right, so today we are talking about species at risk in the Ausable River Watershed. So you might be wondering, where is the Ausable River? So for those of you who are joining us from outside of our watershed, it's located in southern Ontario, specifically on the eastern shore of Lake Huron. And you can see it circled right there. So specifically, we want to think about why the Ausable River is so important. So the watershed itself includes the towns of Lucan, Elsa Craig, Park Hill, Exeter, Grand Bend, and Port Franks. But our jurisdiction has the ABCA, also includes the Bayfield River watershed. We're going to be focusing specifically on the Ausable River today. But if you have any questions about the Bayfield River, I will have my email address at the end, and you're welcome to ask me questions about that, or you can ask them in the chat. So the name Ausable, it comes from early French trappers and traders, and it means of sand, which tells us a little bit about the characteristics of the river, in that the bed of the river pre-contact was mostly sand and probably some gravel as well. So why is it important? About 15% of all the species at risk in Canada occur in the Ausable River watershed. That's a really big proportion. So we have a good responsibility to take care of our land and our waters in this area for that reason. The Ausable River itself outlets into Lake Huron, so it does the Bayfield River. And it's also home to the Pinery Provincial Park. So particularly when it comes to the river outletting into Lake Huron, for those of us who live in Exeter, Lucan, London, Park Hill, any folks living in Godrich, our drinking water comes from Lake Huron. So we want to make sure that how we're treating the land is positively impacting our rivers, because all of that water ends up in our drinking water source. From a human perspective, obviously, there are animal perspectives that we also need to consider when we are thinking about our species at risk. All right, so today we are going to look at what being at risk means. We're going to meet the fish that are at risk in the Ausable River, mussels, freshwater mussels that are at risk. We're going to meet the turtles, and we're going to look at some actions that we can take as individuals. So when we think of being at risk, I like to present it in this pyramid, with each level of pyramid sort of indicating that there's fewer and fewer individuals in a population of a species that we're looking at. So if we start at the very top of our pyramid, extinct means there are none left anywhere in the whole world. In Ontario, there are 8 species at risk, and from an aquatic perspective, 6 of those 8 species are fish. Most of those had to do with overfishing, but it's really important for us to recognize that those extinct species, there are more aquatic species on that list than terrestrial species. Now, extirpated might be a new word for some of us. It's a scientific way of saying locally extinct, and there are 12 of those in Ontario. Now, endangered species means they face extinction. There's very few individuals left of these species. The populations of them are quite small, and there's 126 of them in Ontario. That's quite a lot. Threatened species, there are 63 of them in Ontario, and they are at risk of becoming endangered, so their population is smaller than we'd like it to be, but it's not as small as it would be if it were endangered. And specifically, we have the opportunity to address some of the limiting factors that are impacting a species' ability to survive if they're in that threatened category. Now, special concern species, there are 67 of them in Ontario, and these species are all species that are really sensitive to the human factors that cause species to be at risk, as well as natural factors. So let's explore what those human factors are. So on the upside, there is a handy acronym for us to remember what those human limiting factors for our species at risk are. And that acronym is HIPPO-C. So let's look at what those mean. That first H stands for habitat changes. So that could mean habitat destruction, like draining wetlands or clear cutting a forest. It could also mean, especially for our aquatic species, it could mean changes to water temperature. It could be changes to the bed of the river that they live in, or putting in a dam. Those are all things that cause changes in habitat. The I in HIPPO-C stands for invasive species. So invasive species are species that did not exist in North America pre-contact. So these are species that occurred or occur naturally in the world elsewhere. So a good example of this might be the Norway maple. We can tell by its name that it comes from Norway. Another example specifically for our aquatic species are zebra mussels, which come from sort of the Russian area of the world, the Baltic, the lakes in that area. Pollution is a big reason or factor why species become at risk. Human population and the pressures that our population puts on the land. Overharvesting, which can include overhunting and overfishing. For animal species, overharvesting might be a more appropriate term for our plant species and our fungus species. And finally, that C stands for climate change, because our climate is becoming wetter, warmer, and wilder, and all of those impacts are going to impact the species that live here in the Ausable River. All right, so let's meet some of our fish. So there are 8 species at risk in the Ausable River watershed, and overall there's 85 different species of fish that live in the Ausable River. Now all of these fish, so from the 8 that are at risk to including the and as well as the 85 other species, they all have different habitat requirements, and the way rivers are shaped, they're different over their whole length. So there's multiple different types of habitats throughout a whole river. Now, out of these 8 species, and speaking with some of our fish experts at the Ausable Bayfield Conservation, 2 of these species, the river red horse and the red-side dace, we actually suspect that they are extirpated from the Ausable River watershed. So we had historic records that these existed in our watershed, but they haven't been able to find these fish in quite some time. In any recent sampling, they haven't found them. All right, so let's take a little bit closer look at the black red horse. So the black red horse is a pretty big fish, can be up half a meter in length. That's a big, substantial fish. So a big, substantial fish is going to need a good amount of water. So you're not going to find it up in the headwaters of a watershed where the water tends to be a little bit shallower, but you'll find it in medium-sized rivers. And it really likes a river that has a well-established pool-riffle complex. So pools are those deeper areas of the river where sediments tend to be a little bit softer. So the bottom of the pool might be softer and the current's a little bit slower because they could take a rest there. It's a little bit easier for them to hide in a pool. Remember, they're a pretty big fish. And riffles help provide oxygenation for the river. If you look, you're at a river and you're like, hey, that part looks riffly, that is a riffle. And it's generally rocky, from boulders to gravel. So lots of different sediment sizes can happen in a riffle. And these fish are of special concern because they need clean, clear water. And they also need different habitat requirements throughout their life. So we mentioned that pool riffle. Now they like a little bit shallower, faster moving water. when they're breeding. So they need to lay their eggs in the riffle, but they might find food for themselves because they're a sucker. So they sort of suck up food from the bottom of the river in pools or other parts of the river. So let's take a look at threats to fish sort of on a larger scale. So we talked some specifics for the river red horse, but in general, habitat alteration or destruction is the #1 cause of loss of species for any category that we're talking about, whether it's fish, mussels, turtles, or other species that are not part of this presentation. So those alterations could include impoundment, so putting something in a river that makes it impossible for a fish to get from one part of the river to the other. Changes to the bed of the river, so siltation, when soft sediments like topsoil end up in the river and cover over sand and gravel, when species like the river red horse, for example, or the black red horse need that gravel on which to lay their eggs. If that isn't there, then they're not able to breed successfully. Loss of streamside vegetation is a big one. The introduction of non-native species, pollution, overfishing, and changes to water temperature. Now we're going to look specifically at the loss of streamside vegetation and changes in water temperature and what we can do about it. So one of the big things for us to realize is that streamside vegetation, so in this after photo here, that streamside vegetation is doing so much, not just for the land, because you can see that there's quite a bit of erosion happening in the picture on the left. And there's much less erosion happening here, but it's doing so much for the water and the species that live in the water as well. Streamside vegetation controls the rate and the amount of pollution that is reaching the waters. Trees along stream sides can provide cooling shade, keeping the waters a little bit cooler, which is going to help with climate change. Like I said, we're going to minimize stream bank erosion, so we're not going to get those soft sediments going back into the water, making it harder for fish to lay their eggs if they need gravel or sand to do so. This vegetation is also going to prevent overland flow that might be carrying topsoil or other soft sediments from putting that into the river, because it's increasing the friction or the roughness on the land. The water is going to slow down. It's going to drop the sediment that it's carrying, and most of that water is actually going to be able to infiltrate into the ground instead of going into the river, which are all awesome things. All right, friends, let's take a look at freshwater mussels. All right, so in the Ausable River, there are 26 different freshwater mussels that live there. That's quite a high diversity, but 6 of them, which works out to be about a quarter, are at risk. 3 of them are endangered, and 3 of them are a special concern. Now, mussels are awesome because they help move sediments around, they filter the water, and because they filter the water, which is how they eat, they are really our canaries in the coal mine. They tell us a lot about the water quality and if the water is free of pollution. If our mussel populations are doing well, that means our water is clean and healthy. If our mussel populations are doing poorly, that tells us that the water quality in the river isn't that great. Mussels are important not only to our aquatic species, and we'll talk a little bit about how they're connected to fish in a moment, but they're also really important for terrestrial food chains. They're an important food source for raccoons and muskrats as well. All right, so I am going to show you that one of our species at risk in the Ausable River is the snuff box mussel. And I have a puppet here with me, and this is the snuff box mussel. This right down here, you might think, hey, that looks like a tongue. It's actually what is called the foot of a mussel. And the mussel will use this foot to bury itself into the sediment. And if my hands were the bottom, the bed of the river, it's sort of embedded into there. Now, the snuffbox mussel, like many other mussels, it relies on fish to help disperse its young. So a male mussel will release some sperm into the water. The female mussel will catch that sperm, fertilize her eggs, and then at that point, the larval stage of their young is called a glaucidia. Now, a glaucidia kind of looks like if Pac-Man had a whole bunch of teeth. So think of it that way, or like the fire flower in the tube in Mario Brothers. That's what I think they look like anyways. So what a mussel will do is a mussel will send up lures that look like the food of its fish host. So for the snuffbox mussel, its fish host is the loghead perch. Now the loghead perch is swimming along and it's like, oh, hey, that looks delicious. And when it gets closer, the mussel opens up and then it actually traps the fish in between its shells here. Then what happens is the glaucidia get released onto the log perch, or the loghead perch, and using those teeth, they clamp on to the fish's gills and they're going to suck the gills' blood. And eventually, obviously, the mussel will release the fish. Once it's released its glaucidia, the fish will swim away with the glaucidia attached to its gills. Now, the fish swims away, and while it is a parasitic relationship in that the mussels, the baby mussels, the glaucidia are taking from the loghead perch, they're not actually going to kill it. So it's okay. And a really cool adaptation of this guy is that it has extra strong bones in its neck to withstand being clamped inside the snuff box. Now, this guy will swim around, and then the glaucidia, as they develop, once they're big enough to be juvenile mussels, they will drop off from the gills and embed themselves into the sand at the bottom of the river, just like their parents. They'll be quite small at that point. Because the snuffbox mussel and the loggerhead perch share the same habitat, the mussel knows that once the juvenile mussels drop off of the fish, they're going to be in the right habitat to be able to survive. So when we think about managing mussel populations, we need to manage them closely with our fish species as well. So the snuffbox mussel likes to live in areas where the current is pretty swift. And again, similar to the black red horse, needs sandier, gravelly river beds. And it'll go into a little bit smaller of a river or medium-sized river. And major threats to it include dams, pollution, sedimentation, and invasive species like the zebra mussel. And that's a picture of a real loghead perch there. So overall, some threats to mussels in general, remember there's 26 different species that live in the Ausable River, are habitat changes, invasive species, which can sort of colonize the top of a mussel and prevent it from eating. Pollution is a really big deal. And the loss of a larval host species. So even if there's lots of snuffbox mussels in the river, if there's not a lot of the loghead perch, then there's no way for that species to reproduce. And then historically, before the invention of plastic, mussel shells were used to make buttons. So we're going to look specifically at siltation and what you can do to help prevent siltation. Now we're going to look specifically at a rural or agricultural context, and that's just because in the Ausable River Watershed, that is the majority of our land use there. So in these areas, you want to employ or use on your farm or your property agricultural best management practices. So in terms of preventing siltation to our rivers and streams, those practices include fencing your livestock out of the stream, which will prevent stream bank erosion, and will actually help keep your livestock healthier. So it helps keep the water healthier and your livestock as well. You can also plant a vegetated buffer. And like we talked about with the fish, that vegetation can keep the water cool. It can prevent runoff from getting into the stream. There's so many benefits to planting that buffer. Now, if you look at this buffer, filled with flowers. So all of those flowers are going to serve not only our insect population, our bees, which are facing many threats as well. So it all works together. Positive actions for one species can be positive actions for many. All right, let's talk about turtles. There are 8 species of turtles native to Ontario. We have 7 of them in the Ausable River Watershed. Unfortunately, we used to have the wood turtle, but we don't find it there anymore. And every single one of the turtles in Ontario is at risk, with 3 of them being endangered. We're going to look specifically today at the painted turtle. I chose the painted turtle for our highlighted species today because it is one that we get to see quite a bit. I know for Denise and myself, we work out of Morrison Dam Conservation Area, and there's lots of painted turtles there. So for us who live in Huron County, in Perth County, sort of in that agriculture area, you might be thinking to yourself, but I see that turtle all the time. What do you mean it's at risk? And this is a time when we need to think about the difference between local abundance. So we have lots of them in the reservoir at Morrison Dam, for example, but we need to remember that the population is assessed for being at risk on an Ontario-wide scale. So overall in Ontario, there aren't very many places where we find painted turtles anymore. So where do they live? They love a wetland. They'll also live in lakes and creeks, pretty much any area that is wet. They reach sexual maturity between 6 and 10 years, which means after they hatch, they need to survive for almost a decade before they can start having their own babies. They'll live between 30 and 40 years in the wild, which is another reason why we need to think hard about whether we want to have a reptile as a pet, especially turtles. They're very long-lived. What do they eat? Painted turtles they are an omnivore. They'll eat almost anything. They'll eat algae, they'll eat bugs in the water, they'll eat fish, they'll eat frogs, basically anything they can fit in their mouth, they'll eat it. And major threats to the painted turtle include habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation. So fragmentation is when you have, for example, a large wetland, and then humans decide, oh, hey, we need to put a road here, and that habitat or that wetland gets split in half. And nest predation is something that one could consider to be a natural factor, but with the increase of human population, there comes an increase in those sort of urban rodents that love to eat turtle eggs. Now I said rodents, but that also includes raccoons and skunks, which are not rodents. So urban wildlife. And road mortality, which also ties back to that fragmentation. So overall, when we think about threats to turtles, again, we want to think about that acronym HIPPO-C. Habitat loss and alteration, huge factor. Invasive species like the red-eared slider pictured here, you can see that characteristic red patch right behind where its ear might be, taking over habitat from our native species. Human populations, sometimes people don't like turtles, sometimes they run over them on purpose. Sometimes turtles get tangled up in fishing wires, sometimes they accidentally ingest hooks. All of those things can have a negative impact on our turtles. Water pollution, especially for our turtles like our snapping turtle who likes to eat dead things, if those dead things died because they were polluted, then all of that pollution then ends up inside the snapping turtle. Now, I would say previously, probably like 20 years ago, you could hunt turtles, you could collect them for food. It was quite a common thing to do. I know Denise was sharing with me that she has an old copy of The Joy of Cooking, and there is a recipe for turtle soup in there. In Ontario now, it is illegal to hunt turtles, including snapping turtles. And especially for some of our smaller turtles, like the musk turtle and the spotted turtle, collection for pets, because they're small and cute, have a big impact on their population numbers as well. Now, climate change, the cool thing about turtles is that once they lay their eggs, the mother turtle's job is done. She leaves, she goes back to her wetland. But the temperature of the nest that she's laid her eggs in actually impacts how many of the eggs will end up being female turtles and how many will end up being male turtles. With the increase in temperature, that indicates that more of turtles being born will likely be female turtles. Now, if you only have female turtles, you can't procreate, and so you can't make more. So eventually, the species will decline or die off. So let's look specifically at draining wetlands. So when we look at Southern Ontario here, this is a map of the percentage loss of wetlands from pre-contact, so like think 200 to 400 years ago, to 2002. So for Huron County, we've lost between 65 to 85% of our wetlands. But for large parts of the rest of Ontario, especially Essex County, Lambton County, Middlesex County, they've lost so much wetland. And particularly for areas like Lambton and Essex, pre-contact, those areas were pretty swampy, but now they're some of the best agricultural land in the world. And the reason why they're able to grow crops in there is by draining those wetlands. So in Huron County, we have lost about 72% of our wetlands over the last couple hundred years. So that's reduced our total wetland coverage from about 25% of the land in Huron County to 7%. So you might be wondering, okay, so what does the ABCA do about species at risk? We do things like field research. So for those of you in high school, please note, these are jobs that you could have in the future. You could become a field research scientist specializing in aquatic species. So we go out and we capture fish, measure them, identify them, and then we put them back. We do the same thing with mussels and turtles. We have something called the recovery strategy for species at risk in the Ausable River, and we've used an ecosystem approach for that, and that gives us sort of a guiding principles behind through which to protect these species and help them recover. And then finally, we do things like this. We do a lot of education around species at risk. All right, so I've told you what we do. Now, what can you do? You can become a citizen scientist, especially for mussels. The Toronto Zoo and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans just came out with a new app called the Clam Counter. And you can download that. So whenever you find a mussel shell or a live mussel, you can take a picture of that shell. And this app will help you identify it, and you can put in the location information so that scientists can help track mussel populations over time. Because if we think back to those pictures that I showed about the field research that we do, field research is really intensive, takes a lot of time, and we need more data than we have time to collect. So we need your help with that. Now, if you do collect a live mussel, make sure you put it back in the water where you found it. You can commit to not driving through water bodies. So this is very important for us if we live on rural properties and like to go for a quad or a 4x4, ATV, everyone calls it something different. I want you to commit to not driving through the water bodies, because mussels, If you remember back to those pictures, they kind of just look like rocks. You never know what's in there. We can also think about ways of reducing our impact on the land. So we want to refuse things like single-use plastics. We want to reduce the amount of resources that we take. We want to reuse things, so like reusable utensils, etc. We want to repurpose things. So if you empty a jar, how else can you use that jar? And then finally, we can recycle, remembering that we need to wash our recycling before we put it in our blue box. Otherwise, the recycling plant won't be able to process that. You can report your sightings. For example, if you see a turtle nesting, you can report that to either us at the ABCA or the Huron Stewardship Council. And you can help educate others. Think about what you learned today and how you want to educate others about that. So those are things that you can do on a daily basis, but seasonally, because turtles nest in the spring and they lay their eggs on the land, they will exit their wetland and usually end up somewhere that as humans we're like, why did you choose to lay your eggs in the middle of a path? And it's because they just need sort of loose, sandy soil, or they might just think, hey, this is fine. But if you see a turtle crossing a road, if we think back to our painted turtle that we looked at, road mortality can be a big deal. So if you see a turtle crossing a road, make sure you stop, or if you're with an adult who's driving, ask them to stop. You can help that turtle cross the road. Always take your turtle in the direction in which it is already traveling. If you come across a snapping turtle and it's really big, because they can be up to half a meter, their shell can be half a meter in size, you can just sort of wheelbarrow the turtle across the road. So you can like pick up the back of its shell and it'll walk on its front legs. You can protect turtle nests like this person is right here. So if you have a property and you've got a wetland on your property and you've got turtles, you can install one of those to make sure that those eggs aren't eaten by raccoons or foxes or anyone else who might want to eat them. And you can plant trees and native vegetation, because remember, all of these things, our actions on the land, impact the quality of the water. And then finally, over your whole life, you want to think about maintaining wetlands on your properties, maintaining your woodlots, especially if they're wet woods. And if you are planning on becoming a farmer in the future, you want to make sure that you're using best management practices on your farm to make your farm more productive and keep your soil or your livestock healthy. So I want you folks to think about what actions will you take to help species at risk in your own backyard. If you have younger brothers and sisters or are just interested yourself, we have 2 upcoming webinars or lunch and learns, one next Tuesday and one next Friday. Tuesdays is on river safety, and the one on the 12th is on water and wetlands. You can also visit the ABCA's YouTube channel, which is at the Ausable, for videos on species at risk like the black red horse and the pug nose shiner, which could be of interest to you if you want to know a little bit more about those species. So thank you all so much for attending.